this video is looking at the cognitive approach in psychology, and I hope that the image that you see on your screen now gives you a bit of an idea about what the cognitive approach is interested in and some of the analogies that we're going to be looking at. So, just to give you a bit of a background on the cognitive approach and an idea of where it fits in the timeline of psychology emerging as a science. Up until the 1950s and 1960s, behaviorism was the dominant paradigm in psychology. You remember that behaviorism was the works of Skinner and Pavlov, focusing on behavior. So the behaviorists rejected the study of the mind, and they argued that only observable behaviors should and could be studied. But by the 1950s and 60s, psychologists became a bit dissatisfied with just the focus on observable behaviour and wanted to go back to Wundt's ideas of studying mental processes. So the psychologists began to believe that these internal mental processes, and not just behaviour, should be and could be studied scientifically under strict controlled conditions. And they became interested in studying such mental processes as memory and perception and thinking, decision-making. Hence why it's called the cognitive approach, because it's interested in our cognitions, our mental processes. The arrival of the computer around that same time, around the 1960s, gave cognitive psychologists the terminology and the metaphors that they needed to be able to investigate the mind. So we can see lots of parallels drawn between computers and computer science and the cognitive approach, and that's because they emerged at around the same time. Okay, so the general assumptions of the cognitive approach. Cognitive psychologists assume that the human mind can be investigated scientifically. So cognitive psychologists focus on mental processes, on how people perceive, store, manipulate, and interpret information. And the goal of cognitive psychology is to learn about the mental processes that occur in the mind and to use them to explain how we behave. These internal mental processes are investigated experimentally under very strict and controlled conditions. So although they're rejecting the assumptions of the behaviorists, they're still using the same methods in terms of highly controlled lab experiments. Much of cognitive psychology uses an information processing model. So this is where information is received from our senses, our eyes, our ears, etc., and is processed by various systems in the mind. And because the information processing approach was first used to describe the way that computers process information, what goes on in the human mind is often used is often explained by using computer metaphors. So we often see words like encoding and processing, storage and retrieval when talking about the cognitive approach. And it's because the cognitive psychologists liken the human mind to a computer. So, the key aspects of the cognitive approach. We're just going to be focusing on the role of inference and schemas today, and in the second video you're going to be looking at theoretical and computer models and the emergence of cognitive neuroscience. So, first up is the role of inference. So, again, the cognitive approach is studying information processing, so the way that we extract, store and retrieve information and how this affects our behaviour. So they're interested in studying lots of different types of mental processes. Things like memory and attention, problem solving, etc. So all these mental processes the cognitive psychologists recognise cannot be directly observed. And this is a problem. This is a problem for psychology as a science. Because mental processes cannot be directly observed, it means that we have to study them indirectly by inferring what goes on as a result of the behaviour that we can actually see. So the definition of inference is as follows, and this is an important one for you to commit to memory. So inference is going beyond the immediate evidence to make assumptions about mental processes based on observable behaviour. So we're making assumptions about what's happening in the mind based on what we can see a person doing. And this enables cognitive psychologists to develop theories about mental processes that lead to the observed behaviour. So let's take an example from the multi-store model. So you'll remember that cognitive psychologists, in this case Jacobs, were studying the short-term memory capacity. And they observed that people can only recall between 5 and 9 items. When they give people a list of numbers to remember or a list of letters to remember, they seem to only be able to recall between 5 and 9. So that behaviour that was directly observed was able to then allow the cognitive psychologists to infer make an assumption about the mental processes. And in this case, the inference was that short-term memory has a capacity of 5 to 9 or 7 plus or minus 2 items. We can't directly access short-term memory. We can't directly observe and study it. So the only way that we can make any assumptions or conclusions about any mental process is by observing measurable behavior and making an inference. So inference is a really, really important part of the cognitive approach because we're studying mental processes that can't be directly observed. So we have to go beyond the immediate evidence. We have to base our assumptions on the mental processes based on the observable behavior that we can see. So the role of inference is an important assumption of the cognitive approach. Another important assumption of the cognitive approach is the role of schemas. So schemas are a cognitive framework or a collection of ideas about a person, object, or situation that's formed through experience. And it helps us to organise and interpret information and to understand and predict the world around us. So you can think of these as a cognitive framework or a packet of information. I always think about schemas like these little folders. Each of these folders we have in our mind that are stored nice and neatly in our mind. And this allows us to be able to quickly access these schemas and access very quickly all of the information that's contained inside. Now, as we encounter new information through experience, we can add to our schemas, we can put more information in there, we can take things out, we can alter the information, and then put it neatly back into that folder and store it in our minds for when we next need it. This is how I like to conceptualize the idea of a schema. It just helps me to sort of visualize it, because otherwise it's quite an abstract idea. But schemas are these packets of information, and we have them about everything. We have them from birth. We have very, very basic schemas when we're born. These are to do with sort of grasping and sucking. And these schemas grow more and more complex as we experience more of the world. So you have schemas, for example, about how to behave in different situations. So you know how to behave at a restaurant. You have schemas for how to use a knife and fork. You have schemas for how you talk to older people. You have schemas for school. And your schemas are informed by your experiences. So if you have positive experiences at school, then that's going to be contained within your schema. And it's going to affect how you see school. So our schemas are based on experience, and they affect how we interpret the world around us. They're useful for a number of reasons. They allow us to take shortcuts when we're processing large amounts of information that we have to deal with on a daily basis. And this, allows us to sort of filter out the noise and focus on what's really important, and allow us to not have to process information from the start every time we encounter it, but base our interpretation of the world on our previous experiences. So it is very, very helpful and necessary for us to deal with huge amounts of information. However, they are also a hindrance in some respects. So they can lead us to have cognitive errors and biases or heuristics, depending on the terminology and what field you're approaching this from. So schemas basically cause us to exclude anything that doesn't conform to our established ideas about the world. Anything that doesn't fit is forgotten and ignored. And schemas help us fill in the gaps in the absence of full information about a person. So when we're making first judgments, when we're judging a person based on our instincts, this is relying on the information that's contained within our schemas. So it's helpful when we need to make snap judgments about a situation or a person, but a consequence of this is that it can lead to stereotypes. And so because we've got such strong information held within our schemas, even if we are faced with new and conflicting information, it's really difficult to disconfirm our existing ideas. And this is how stereotypes and prejudice occurs. And it can lead to general cognitive biases and errors in processing. So those of you that attended Blanche's PsychSoc talk will have heard her speaking about the halo effect. And so this halo effect is the idea that somebody who has got positive traits, like for instance they're attractive, are then also seen to have other desirable traits like higher intelligence or a sense of humour, for example. And this is a cognitive bias that's related to our schemas. So our schema is that attractive people are also intelligent, and therefore any new people that we encounter, any new information, also fits into this schema, and we judge people accordingly. This can be beneficial in some cases, but also it can lead to negative stereotypes as well. So schemas are helpful in that they allow us to take lots of mental shortcuts, but are sometimes difficult as well because they cause errors in our judgment, and our judgment of people particularly. So I just want to show you an example here, and I'm sure you would have seen this before, and we're going to be looking at this in our lessons as well. Just pause and have a read of this. So you'll be able to read this pretty remarkably, actually, even though all of the letters are all jumbled up. And this is because your schemas for reading and for words and the order of words in a sentence, the syntax, is allowing you to take shortcuts and be able to read the words that you see here. So this is an example of how schemas can be really helpful. It means that we don't have to, every time we're reading, individually break down words into the letters and then the words and then the sentences. It allows us to take shortcuts so we can process this text a lot quicker. You can see how helpful this is in our everyday life. But it can also be unhelpful in some ways. I'd like you to have a read of this. So in this case, some of you might have picked this up. You might have picked this up now that you've read it again and again and again, but actually the is printed twice here. Now, our schemas, as helpful as they are in allowing us to take shortcuts, also means that sometimes these shortcuts lead to errors and we miss things that we're not looking for. We don't expect to see the printed twice, and so we simply miss it because our schema is not primed to attend to that kind of information. So schemas are really helpful in a lot of respects. They allow us to make quick judgments, which are often necessary for our survival and for dealing with lots of information, but also mean that we make errors that we're not even aware of. And these errors can sometimes lead to severe consequences like prejudice and discrimination. So we've looked today just at the role of inference and schemas, and we're going to next time be looking at the theoretical and computer models and the emergence of cognitive neuroscience.